Good evening, everyone. My name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX news feed, and this is Trial Watch. However, I am not in the territory. I'm actually up in Jacksonville, Florida, in Duval County, where this case we're going to discuss is being tried. Before I get into this, I want you to please understand this was a long day of hours and hours of testimony. I have a notebook full of notes. I'm going to do my best to move through this, but there's no way I'm going to be able to get everything in there. But I'm going to do my best to really give you an outline and an understanding of what happened in the courtroom today, the scene in the courtroom today, and everything like that. Also, another disclaimer quickly, this is a case of sexual battery. So there's going to be explicit language, emotional testimony. And if you aren't comfortable with that, I would recommend not continuing through this video. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the details of this case, former Senator Steven Payne Sr. is charged with one count of sexual battery that allegedly occurred between 2018 and 2019 in Duval County. And the charging document states that he's accused of placing a sex toy inside the vagina of a minor. Now, back in the territory, you may have heard of other incidents Payne is accused of involving other women. However, the only thing that he is on trial for in Florida is for this one incident that occurred in that time period. However, we are going to hear testimony about other instances, and we even heard from a witness who accused Payne of something in 2005. So there was a jury pool of 8 people, and the judge began the trial by giving them basic instructions and explaining the charge of the case. In the courtroom, we had Steven Payne. He was wearing a blue suit. His brother, Clarence Payne, and I believe his mother were in attendance, sitting in the gallery. And then on the side I was sitting on, there was a woman sitting on the witness bench, and I found out that this was Danae DeSuy. I spoke with her attorney. DeSuy is the former staffer of former Senator Payne, who accused him of an incident in St. Croix in February of 2022 at a hotel. However, we didn't hear anything about that incident in court today. The judge ruled that it wasn't allowed to be introduced in testimony. So her attorney told me that Ms. DeSuy was there today to support the main witness and the person who this case centers around, the person who Payne is accused of sexually battering, Steffi Emilian. So, before I get into the opening arguments and all of these witnesses that were introduced, I want to give you a background that we can use as a base point and a reference point for this case, because there were multiple witnesses, and each witness, you have to start over. So we heard a lot of repetition in court today. Every witness, they begin, how do you know Steffi Emilian, blah, 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 all of these things, background. So I want to give you the baseline that both the prosecution and the defense agree upon. And then I'll go into the details of the testimony where it maybe differed or was inconsistent. But here's what we need to understand going in. This case centers on a woman who is now 24 years old. Her name is Steffi Emilian, and she moved to St. John in 2007. She moved to St. John when she was 7 years old. And she did that because life in St. Lucia, where she was born, was difficult. Her mother was having a hard time raising her. And when the opportunity came for her to live with someone in St. John, the mother jumped on it. This woman who she lived with on St. John at first was named Madeline Marsh. We heard her referred to as Miss Madeline throughout the trial a lot today. And she lived with Miss Marsh, or Miss Madeline, for several years. And then for certain reasons, which we'll hear about later on, the living situation became very difficult, and Miss Madeline started threatening to send Steffi back to St. Lucia. At this point, either Steven Payne or his girlfriend, Noelise Powell, that's up for debate about who made the move to have this happen, helped Steffi move into another residence. She moved into the home of Noelise Powell, Steven Payne's girlfriend. This was because Noelise Powell and Steven Payne managed and co-managed a band that Steffi was in called the Avengers. And it was in the home of Noelise Powell where the prosecution says the first incident we're going to hear about happened. Then, after living with Noelise Powell, Steffi then moves to Florida. She moves to Florida because after the storms in 2017, as everyone in the territory knows, life was quite difficult, and they decided they would send her to Florida to continue school up there. And she lived in the home of Shade Powell. This is the daughter of Noelise Powell, Steven Payne's girlfriend. This is where the prosecution alleges the second incident we're going to hear about happened, but not the main incident that the case focuses on. And then for reasons that weren't openly discussed in front of the jury, she is no longer welcome in Shade Powell's home. So she then moves in with Steven Payne's sister, Lauren Harris. And it's in the home of Lauren Harris that this third incident we hear about, which is the main incident in this case, the sexual battery, allegedly occurred while she was living with Steven Payne's sister, Lauren Harris. Okay, now that we have that background, I'm going to switch over to my other notebook, and I'm going to explain the opening statements from the prosecution. They basically said everyone was here today because Steffi, at the age of 17, was sexually battered by Steven Payne. They said that this was a man she trusted, a man who was acting as her guardian, and who they say she loved as a father. They then ran through this timeline of events that I just briefly laid out for you. Then we heard the opening statements from the defense, those representing Steven Payne. And they said that they were proud to represent Steven Payne. They described him as a father, a son, a brother, a friend, a former police officer, a former senator. And what they really drilled home in their opening statement was that there was no physical evidence in this case. There's no DNA. And that's actually something I want to remark on quickly. As I said, this was a long day of testimony. But what we didn't see is, in previous cases, you're probably familiar with things like DNA being introduced, things like emails or credit card receipts or text messages, videos, anything. We basically saw none of that today. This is a case that relies completely on testimony, on he said, on she said. So the defense really drove home that point in their statements. Okay, so the first witness that was called by the prosecution, and this was Steffi's mother. Her name is Teresa Emelian. I'm going to refer to her as Teresa just so we don't get confused with last names. The prosecution began by asking if English was her first language. Teresa said no, but she could understand what the prosecution was saying. I want to point out, before I get really into her testimony, that she was a witness that it was easy for both the prosecution and the defense to lead her in her statements. For example, she wasn't speaking as I am, giving a recap of her memory of things. She was being asked questions and only really giving yes or no answers to those questions. So, for example, she wasn't saying, "Oh, I was wearing a red shirt." The attorneys would say, "And you were wearing a red shirt. Is that correct?" And she would say, "Yes." That's just an example. So she said that she sent Steffi to St. John because living conditions were difficult. And that she felt comfortable with this because it was a friend of a friend, and that she only learned that Steffi was having issues with her living situation when she got a call from Steven Payne, Sr., who said that Marsh was kicking her out. Teresa said that this upset her. She started crying, and then that Steven Payne asked if he could adopt Steffi, watch over her, be her guardian, and Teresa agreed. However, no paperwork was ever signed. This was a guardianship based on a verbal commitment, an understanding between Teresa, Steffi's mother, and Steven Payne, according to Teresa's testimony. She said she felt comfortable giving him this guardianship because she knew that Steffi was in a band with him, and she trusted him to watch over her. So she also was aware of all of the moves that Steffi then made to Noah Elise Powell's home, then to Shade Powell's home, and then to Lauren Harris's home. She agreed to these. She was aware of them. Something that's very important to talk about in her testimony is that this reason for why Steffi left the home of Shade Powell, that's the daughter of Noah Elise Powell, the girlfriend of Steven Payne, the defense attorneys asked Teresa if she knew why Steffi was, quote, put out of that house. And Teresa said she didn't really know, but she knew the situation was bad and that Shade was apparently doing things like not speaking to Steffi and not feeding her. The attorney then asked, do you know if Steffi made allegations towards Mark? This is Shade's husband. And Teresa said, I don't know. This wasn't discussed further in terms of the testimony, but it was brought up later when the jury was not in the courtroom. And this was because what the defense was trying to work in is that apparently Steffi did make certain accusations against Shade's husband. However, the judge ruled that because of something called a rape shield law, and that does not mean that she accused him of rape, it's just the name of the law. Because of that, they weren't allowed to discuss the reason behind Steffi apparently leaving this home. However, for those of us who were there, not the jury, we understand that there was some kind of allegation made and maybe some kind of sexual misconduct that happened here. Okay, so, and forgive me referring to my notes, I'm gonna flip through a couple pages. Okay, so after Teresa, Steffi's mother, left the stand, the prosecution brought in Steffi Emelian herself. She was wearing a kind of a hoodie, a zip-up hoodie, gray pants. She didn't seem incredibly comfortable being there. And when she first started speaking, her voice was a little shaky. She seemed almost close to tears. She discussed her living arrangement with Miss Marsh. That was the first person she lived with on St. John. She said it was okay up until she was about 10 years old. And then she said Miss Marsh started hitting her and calling her names and wouldn't let her go places. Her voice cracks again here and she started to cry. There was then a break and where she just gathered herself. Testimony continued. She said when she was 13, that's when she joined this band, the Avengers, that Steven Payne and Noah Elise Powell allegedly managed together. She said that Payne had approached her with his son, Steven Payne Jr., and that they had both asked her to join this band, and that this was the first time when he approached her that she had had a full conversation with him. She said she knew him from around because he was a police officer that worked at the school she went to. This was Julius Sprouse School on St. John. She said that when she joined the band, she was the only female. They practiced all the time, 5 times a week, and her nickname was Supergirl while she was in this band. And so when her living arrangements changed for the first time, Steffi said that Steven Payne was actually the one who told her that Marsh was going to send her, that Miss Madeline Marsh was going to send her back to St. Lucia. And she said that Payne, Miss Madeline, and Miss Powell all sat down together and had this discussion. And that Payne then called her mother and asked if he could be the guardian. All of this is what we heard in that background So now I'm going to get into the first detail of assault that we heard Steffi explain today. So she said when she was around 15 to 16 years old, this is when she was living with Shawnalise Powell, and she was there for about 2 years. She said that while she liked these living arrangements, it was way better than Miss Madeline Marsh, and she felt a connection with Powell because Powell was herself from St. Lucia. She said that one day, Steven Payne told Miss Powell that he wanted to get to know Steffi better, that he was kind of her guardian and he had only spent time with her in group settings. So he wanted to take her on what was referred to in the trial as this daddy-daughter date. Steffi said that he took her over to St. Thomas for the day, and that during the day on St. Thomas, she said there were no red flags. She used that term. But that when they were coming back to St. John, it was later on the ferry, around 8 p.m., that Payne said he had forgotten something in the band room that they used for that band, the Avengers. She said that she went with him to get whatever this was, but when they got into the room, she said that Steven Payne was just sat down in a desk chair and started talking to her. So she sat down on the couch. And then she says that Steven Payne allegedly called her to come over to him on this chair. So she went over to him, and this is where she says that he grabbed her hands and he pulled her closer, and she said she didn't want to go closer, but that he kind of raised his voice at her. And she said she was hesitant, she pulled back, but he then grabbed her, picked her up, and put her onto his lap so that she was straddling him face to face. She said he then allegedly grabbed her face and, quote, put his tongue in my mouth. Her voice starts cracking here again. We can tell she's on the verge of tears. She said she was so uncomfortable. She was just 15 years old. And that after this happened, they left the room and that Payne acted like nothing had happened. She said they never talked about it again. And she then went home and she said she didn't tell Shawnalise Powell because she said that she knew Powell was close with Payne and that she didn't think Miss Powell would believe her. And she never spoke of it again. The second incident that we heard about happened after the storms. This is in October of 2017. This is when Steffi is living with Shade Powell, Shawnalise's daughter, in Kissimmee, Florida. Steffi is in 11th grade. She's 16, turning 17, she says. And so she moves in with Shade. Sorry, let me just look back at my notes quickly. Okay. She moves in with Shade, and she says that Steven Payne actually brought her to Florida on that move. And that the day after this move, Payne asked if she had ever been on a roller coaster before. And she said she hadn't. So Payne said he was going to take her to Universal Studios. Steffi said she was nervous to go, that she didn't want to go, but that there were supposed to be 2 others joining on this trip to the amusement park. And that was Steven Payne Jr., Steven Payne's son, and a friend named Giovanni. She says that when they left to go on this trip, though, they never picked them up. Instead, she says that Payne brought her to a hotel room. And when they arrived at the hotel, there was only one bed. She said that he put his things down, and then she says he started taking off his clothes, that he got completely naked. And he said his body was hurting from all the driving that he had done. So he laid down on the bed and he asked her to massage his legs, she said. She said he was completely naked, laying with his back on the bed, face up, and that he gave her lotion and asked her to rub his legs from the feet up. And she said that he started asking her to go massage his inner thigh, but she didn't want to, and she felt very uncomfortable, but he told her not to be afraid. At this point, the prosecution asked her if there was anything distinct that she remembered about Payne's body. And all she said was that she remembered he was very, very hairy. She said he had a lot of body hair from his chest all the way down. She said that while he was massaging, while she was giving him this massage on his legs, she said he started telling her that when he was with his daughter back in Tortola, when his daughter was her age, that he used to shower with his daughter and that they should shower together. And Steffi said she didn't feel like she had a choice in this, that she felt as if she was pressured in to the shower with him. She said, quote, "I didn't know what to do. I was overthinking everything." When they were in the shower, both naked, she says that he told her not to be afraid, and that he took a rag and scrubbed her back, and that he then had her go and scrub his. And once again, while he was doing this, he was telling her it wasn't a big deal. This was something he did with his daughter in Tortola. She said the shower lasted around 20 minutes, and then they went back into the room, but she said she didn't even sleep. She said she curled up on like a chair in the hotel room and that she never actually got into bed with Payne. It's important to remember here, a side note, that she said she got into this chair because this was brought up later on by the defense to kind of try and say her story wasn't accurate. So just remember, she said she slept in this chair bench thing, not in the bed. She said the next day, same thing happened as the first incident she described. They never talked about it again. It just wasn't brought up. And the next day they went and they picked up Steven Payne Jr. and Giovanni and they went to this park. She says that she then went and talked about this living situation with Shade Powell, because remember, she's living with her. And this is the living situation where allegedly, although it wasn't discussed in front of the jury, maybe there was some misconduct with the husband, or at least Steffi kind of said that. Once again, this is not something the jury knows, only discussed in front of the judge and the attorneys. She said, Steffi said in court in front of the jury that the reason she left Shade's home was because the situation got, quote, rough towards the end. That's all the jury heard her say about that. So at this point, she then moved to Jacksonville to stay with Steven Payne's sister, Lauren Harris. Now, it is with Lauren Harris that this incident that's at the center of the case happened, that what he's charged with sexual battery for allegedly happened. She says that Steven Payne drove her from Shade Powell's home to Lauren Harris's home. She says that they got there around like in the afternoon, and that the next day when both Lauren Harris's husband, and Steven Payne Jr., who was living in that house at the time also, when everyone was out of the house, it was around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and she said that Steven Payne told her he had something for her. She said he was staying in the guest room of this home that had 5 bedrooms total, and that she was confused because she didn't ask Payne for anything. But he was in this guest room looking through his suitcase, and when she was standing there watching, she then says she saw him pull something that was pink out of his suitcase. She said it had a wire and a remote and a silver bullet at the end. Steffi says that Payne told her this was a vibrator, and that he told her that he knew she had never had an orgasm before, but that today she would learn how. She said that Payne said he was going to teach her how to have an orgasm with this vibrator, and that he then took her by the arms, and she said he flung her onto the bed, and that he then took off her pants and her underwear. At this point, Steffi has started crying quite. She's very emotional. There are tears. She's having a hard time speaking. So the things kind of paused for a moment for her to gather her thoughts. And this next portion of her testimony is the most graphic that we're going to hear. And she was definitely struggling through this. She said that he took this vibrator and that he started rubbing it on her clit, as she called it. She says he then took it and started putting it inside of her multiple times. And that while he was doing this, She said he was telling him about all the emotions she should be having while she was having an orgasm. She says he told her that when she had this orgasm, her toes were going to curl in. She says while she was laying there and while he was penetrating her with this object, she was thinking to herself, asking, quote, "Lord, why do I have to go through all of these things?" The prosecution then asked her to identify if the man who did this to her was in the courtroom. And Steffi stood up and, with her arm outstretched, pointed to Payne across the room and was asked to describe him. And she did. And so the judge said, let the record reflect that this witness has identified this man as the person who she says did this to her. And sorry, one moment, let me collect myself. Once again, a lot of notes here today. The prosecution then asked if how this incident stopped. And she said that she thinks he just kind of stopped this because he could see how uncomfortable she was and that she wasn't going to have an orgasm, at which point he told her to put back on her pants, and that they then just left the room. Once again, didn't talk about this ever again, and that they went to pick up Steven Payne Jr. from school. She was asked if she told anyone about this, and she said she didn't say anything because she was living with her sister. Steffi said she really liked Steven Payne's sister, Lauren Harris, who she apparently referred to as Auntie Lori. She said she didn't want to tell her. She didn't think she would believe her. This was Auntie Lori's brother. She said that Steven Payne came to visit a couple times after this, but that when he did, she would stay in her room and she was very withdrawn. She said that it was probably obvious for other people because she normally wasn't this way, and after that, she never wanted to interact with him. So then what happens is Steffi graduates from high school. She graduates, and a couple days later, she's back on a plane to St. Lucia. She said that she remained in touch with Steven Payne after going back to St. Lucia because she was under the impression that Steven Payne was going to help her get a visa so that she could come back to the United States and go to college. A quick note that I didn't mention earlier, when Steffi left the Virgin Islands after the storms, we heard testimony today from several people that her visa had expired to be in the United States, that she didn't make that move from the territory to Florida legally. In fact, Shawnalise Powell, Steven Payne's girlfriend, testified that she did use the records of another woman to get Steffi on a plane and disguise her identity to get her to Florida. So there are a lot of issues with visas and whether or not Steffi's allowed to be in the United States. So yes, she said that she was in touch with Payne and was in touch with his sister, Auntie Lori, after leaving because she was trying to coordinate getting back to the United States. She also said that she was in touch with Auntie Lori, or Lauren Harris, because there were some medical issues that she was experiencing and also medical issues that her nephew was experiencing in St. Lucia, and that Lauren Harris was a registered nurse. And so she said she reached out to her for medical advice. The prosecution closed their examination and their questioning of Steffi by asking, "Did you love Mr. Payne as a father?" Steffi said yes, she did. And then the prosecution asked if she had ever filed a case for money against Mr. Payne, or if she had ever, used this case as a way to get citizenship or a green card, if she had ever been bribed. Steffi said no to all of those. And the prosecution then asked her, "Are you getting anything at all for testifying today?" And Steffi said no. Okay, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Okay, so then there was a break for lunch. The jury was excused, everyone was excused. But when we came back to the courthouse, this is where there's going to be a little gap in what I'm able to tell you, because the bailiff of the courthouse actually locked me out and didn't let me in. It's unclear why she didn't. I was there waiting to get in, but I basically missed a significant portion of the cross-examination that the defense did on Steffi. So I'm kind of cutting in halfway here. But what I do know is that the prosecution, and I know this because I spoke with attorneys afterwards, not the prosecution, excuse me. I do know that the defense introduced certain text messages, and also they talked about a photo. That photo was never introduced as evidence. I cannot tell you exactly what these text messages say. And this isn't even because I wasn't in the courtroom for this specific portion. This is because those text messages aren't available to the public. And unlike other trials where they may be on a screen for everyone to see, they were not on a screen for the public or the gallery to view. But I can tell you the gist of what they said. And I can also tell you what was discussed about this photo that was not introduced even to the jury. It was just spoken about. And this is the photo that relates to that chair or bench in the hotel room where Steffi alleges that that second incident happened around the amusement park and everything. Okay, so these text messages that the defense is cross-examining Steffi about talk a lot about money. And this is Steffi apparently reaching out and talking about asking for money, medical expenses for her nephew, who apparently had cerebral palsy. Also, apparently, the defense is saying text messages asking for money for Pampers and diapers and things like that. Steffi says that these text messages, which, by the way, were almost all of them were with Lauren Harris, Auntie Lori. She says that these weren't she wasn't really asking for money so much as telling them what was going on in her life. She wanted them to care. She says she wanted them to basically show that they were still there for her. Now, what it appeared to me, and what I can kind of understand from all of this back and forth about these messages, is that the defense is trying to show and paint Steffi as a person who is asking for money. Maybe even, this word wasn't used, but maybe even kind of a blackmailing situation, and that Payne wasn't sending it, and Steffi was angry, and this money was all caught up in whether or not this is a true or accurate story that Steffi Emilian is telling. The defense asked her, you're mad at you that Payne wasn't answering your text messages and getting you back to the United States. Steffi said, no, she just was upset that he wasn't responding in general. It wasn't about the money. Again, it wasn't about not getting her back to the United States. It was about this person who she thought cared. She said, despite all of the things that had happened, this was still someone who was, in a way, her father figure, a kind of support system who had supported her for years, and who now all of a sudden wasn't in her life in this way. When asked why she eventually brought this up and why she came out with her story, Steffi said that it was because she was just ready to come forward with this. But the defense asked her if she had ever applied for something called a U visa for victims. And she said that she hadn't personally applied for one. But the defense said that you do understand that this visa is a way to gain residency or citizenship for, victims of certain crimes. And what we understood is that, yes, there were discussions about Steffi perhaps applying for one of these. However, on the cross-examination, the prosecution made it clear and asked her explicitly, did you ever get this visa document? She said, no. They said, are you under the impression you'll get one now? She said, no. They said, so you're not testifying for that? She said, no. Okay. Looking down here. Okay, so this is where we get to that photo. So the defense talked about a photo, didn't show the actual photo, but they talked about a photo that was apparently a mirror selfie that Steffi took in the hotel room where she said Payne made her massage him and then the shower happened. And apparently in this photo, there's no bench or no chair in this room. So what they were trying to say is, so you weren't telling the truth about where you slept, because obviously in this photo, this doesn't exist. But when the prosecution came back and did their redirect, they asked Steffi, this was years and years and years ago. Isn't it possible that your memory of exactly where the chair was has changed? Isn't it possible it isn't in this photo? And Steffi said yes. Okay, so going to stop quickly and say, refer back to the beginning when I told you about the lack of physical evidence and things like that in the trial. These text messages that I talked about, which I haven't seen directly, and this photo, which no one other than the attorneys have seen, these are the only things introduced as evidence, as if you will, outside of the testimony of all of these different people. Okay, so then Steffi leaves the stand. Her testimony is done, and the prosecution calls someone named Detective Ward. He's with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and he was the person working for the Special Assault Unit, and he was assigned Steffi's case. He said it was forwarded to him by the FBI. I am not going to dwell a lot on Detective Ward's testimony because he was, I don't know if evasive is the right word, but it was obvious that he wasn't answering questions on purpose. I am not sure exactly why he was being evasive, if you will, in this manner. I talked to actually the attorney for Danae DeSuy, and asked him if he knew why. And he said it might have something to do with certain things that were restricted to be brought up or things like that. So, for example, he wasn't able to, he said he didn't ever talk to Steven Payne Jr., the son. The defense asked if forensics were a big area of evidence in this in cases. Detective Ward said they were in some cases, not exactly in this one. Again, he really kind of wasn't answering questions. The thing I want you to understand about his testimony is that the case was being investigated by the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department, and also that through his investigation, he was able to corroborate things about Steffi being the guardian of Steven Payne Sr. But when asked about things involving the VI, it was outside of his jurisdiction. And I'm sorry, I just want to take a moment. I feel like I didn't do a great job of explaining that. I want to make it clear it wasn't like this detective was openly being a difficult witness. He was just saying a lot of, I can't answer that. I don't recall that exact detail, that kind of thing. One note, when the defense asked if he ever found a vibrator in this case, he said no, he didn't. And then when the prosecution spoke to the detective again, they asked him why there wasn't any DNA evidence in this case. And he said there was no DNA evidence because this was such a delayed disclosure of information. You know, years and years later, there's not going to be swabs, if you will, of DNA or anything like that. He also said that because of jurisdiction, he was only able to get search warrants for certain things, for certain areas, etc. Okay, the last witness that was called by the prosecution was a woman named Chesney Jones. For those of you viewing in the territory, you may recognize the name. Miss Jones is the woman who posted on Facebook accusing Steven Payne of an incident on a beach in St. John in 2005. Where she said there was sexual assault and misconduct that happened. So I'm going to go through her testimony now. She said that she met Payne because she was a secretary at the she had an administrative role at the Julius Sprouse School on St. John, and that they were friendly because of that. She said they also met through a church gathering, and that she was involved in another one of the bands, not the Avengers, that Steven Payne managed. So they were friendly. They knew each other. Chesney Jones says that when she was working for the school, she was also in the process of testing to become a Virgin Islands police officer. And she said that because she knew Mr. Payne was an officer of VIPD who worked at the school, when she was accepted into the VIPD program, she was excited to tell him. She says that, she went to him and that he was also excited for her on this news, and that he told her he wanted to give her advice and guidance about being a police officer and how to manage that. There are two things that Chesney Jones talked about in her testimony. One was an incident that happened at the school, and the other was the incident on the beach. So she says that at the school, after she told Steven Payne about this news, that he one day asked her to prove that she could do push-ups, to show him her form for push-ups. She said this was at the school in his office, that she was wearing her work clothing or professional clothing, and she felt uncomfortable that he was doing this. But she said she told herself, you're overthinking it, and to just go along with it. She said it was awkward and that he watched her go and do her push-ups, and that he even told her to close the door so no one could see so she wouldn't be uncomfortable. And so that was kind of the extent of this situation. But what Chesney Jones was trying to say is that she'd had this experience with him before that made her uncomfortable. But she said that Payne then said he could show her certain defensive tactics to give her what she says he described as a leg up in training for the Virgin Islands Police Department. And she says that Payne suggested they do this defensive training at the beach, and that they do it around 5 p.m. and that they do it there at that time so that there wouldn't be a lot of people there to watch. She said that Payne picked her up from her house and took her to the beach. She doesn't remember what beach it was, but she says she does remember there weren't really a lot of people there, and that Steven Payne made sure that they went far away from anyone who maybe was on the beach. Chesney Jones says that she was wearing a big white t-shirt and gray sweatpants for this training. But that when they got to the beach, she thought they were going to have this training on the sand. But then she says Payne said, let's go in the water. Let's go swimming. Chesney Jones said she then told Payne that she wasn't wearing the right clothes. She couldn't go swimming. And that Payne told her to just wear her underwear. And that anyone down the beach you might see, they'll just think it's a swimsuit. Chesney said she was uncomfortable. She didn't really want to do this, but once again, she told herself she was just overthinking it. She says she took off her sweatpants, but kept her big t-shirt on and went in the water with him. She said that he was wearing his boxers or his shorts and was shirtless. She said that when they got into the water, Payne told her to turn around and that he was going to show her how to get out of a hold from behind, as if someone was holding her from behind, a way to defend herself. And he grabbed her from behind while they were in the water. She says he then told her that to get out of this specific situation with a person, the way to deal with it was to grab the person by the balls. And that he told her to go ahead and grab him in that way by the balls. She said that this made her incredibly uncomfortable, but she reached around to kind of mimic the motion, but that she didn't actually grab his testicles because she didn't want to. At that point, she says that he told her, "Don't be scared, just do it. Nothing bad's going to happen." She said that she really didn't want to. At this point on the stand, Chesney is having a difficult time having a difficult time testifying, and she actually starts crying. And she asked to take a moment, and there was probably a full minute to 2 minutes of just silence in the courthouse where Chesney just collected herself and took a moment to breathe. When she resumed her testimony, she said that Payne then asked her to do this again, to, grab him in that area. And that once again, she didn't want to touch him, but she made the mimicking motion again. And this time she said that she felt his testicles, and that she realized that he was actually placing them so that she would touch them, that she was only moving her hand like to mimic that area, but that he was the one that was putting himself in that position, if you will. She said that she felt uncomfortable. She, didn't want to be doing this, and she tried to pull away from him, and that he was grabbing on to her underwear at this point. So when she tried to get away from him, he tore her underwear. She said, quote, "He tears my panty. And when I tried to pull away, he tried to hold me back." She said that she then froze, and that he kind of froze, and that she then started to get away from him. She got out of the water. The prosecution then asked her to identify if the man who had done this to her was in the courtroom today. She stood up, she pointed to Payne and said, "It's the man right there wearing the blue suit." Just a quick side note, during all of this testimony, I can't really give you an idea of what Steven Payne's reactions were. His back was to me, and from the position I was in, I could not see his face. All I can tell you is that he was sitting between his two defense attorneys, watching all of this testimony happen. Chesney Jones said that Payne then gave her a ride home after this incident, and that she felt like she didn't have another option, and that on the ride home, she was scared, and he kept asking her if everything was okay. Why are you being so quiet? Are you okay? She said that in the car ride, she could see his weapon, his gun. Remember, he was an officer for VIPD, sitting in the car, and that she thought to herself, if I bring up anything right now, he could do something even worse to me. So she decided to just tell him she was okay. She said, quote, "I didn't want to end up missing." So she told him she was okay, and she was dropped off at home, but she said she didn't tell anyone about this at first. And then a while later, the first person she actually told, she said, was an officer for VIPD named Derek Callwood. She said she told Mr. Callwood this, just talking as a friend, not as a formal complaint or report. Chesney said that after this whole incident, she did see Steven Payne at school, at the Julius Sprouse School again, but that after this, he never spoke to her again, never even made eye contact with her. He completely ignored her and acted like this had never even happened. She says that she came forward and told her story officially to the public when she saw the news that Payne was running for Senate. She said that when she saw he was running, she was immediately repulsed by it, and she felt she had a duty to let the people of the Virgin Islands know that this was not the right man for the job. So she then went and posted on Facebook. The jury is actually then shown this Facebook post. We didn't see it in the courtroom, but I know that screenshots of it are still available on Facebook. And So apparently the VIPD eventually contacted her after she made this post on Facebook. And in this post, she detailed what I've already detailed about what happened with the push-ups and then what happened at the beach. At the end of this post, she said that she didn't report this because she knew there wasn't really any physical evidence. The exact language she used was something along the lines of like, oh, what was the evidence? A wet pair of ripped panties? Please, who's going to take that? Once again, that is me paraphrasing, not verbatim. The prosecution then asked her if at any point in her actual VIPD training to become an officer, if she had ever gone through anything like what happened on the beach with Mr. Payne. And she said no, she had not. This was the end of that initial questioning of Chesney Jones by the prosecution. We now moved into cross-examination by the defense. And I want to let you know that this cross-examination between attorney Darcy Gallner, who represented one of the attorneys representing Steven Payne, and Chesney Jones, I'm going to describe it as contentious. On both sides, there was sass thrown out, even a couple chuckles in the courtroom, even though this was serious testimony, just based on the responses and the way they were given, or this back and forth. So the prosecution began by asking if Ms. Jones Chesney had met with prosecutors before this. She said she had, but it had been fewer than 5 times. And the defense asked if she was getting paid for her testimony. She said she wasn't getting paid, but they were reimbursing for her expenses for getting here. She said she drove here from where she lives in South Carolina. The defense then asked where she was staying, and it wasn't clear until a little while later why they were asking this, but apparently Chesney is staying in the same hotel as Steffi Emilian. And the defense asked her if she had spoken with Steffi, specifically if she had had dinner with Steffi. And Chesney said she had had lunch. And so this was kind of an effort to show they were very friendly, I guess. But Chesney said that she never knew Steffi before all of this stuff had kind of come out, before her post. She said she was introduced to and began interacting with Steffi because of this case. Now, the defense then started cross-examining her about her acceptance into the VIPD class. And what they were trying to say is, did Mr. Payne offer to do this training with you after you were accepted into the academy? Or excuse me, after you accepted into VIPD, or did he offer to do this training after you were told that there was going to be something called let me find the word, an agility test? So what Chesney was saying was that Payne had approached her just after she told him she had been accepted to VIPD. The defense was trying to ask her if she approached Payne specifically in relation to this thing called an agility test. And this is where it kind of got a little contentious. She was saying no, it was after she was just accepted to VIPD. And the defense kept kind of drilling into this. And finally, Miss Jones kind of quipped and said, "Are you not understanding what I'm saying?" And they went back and forth a little bit. She said, "I told you this was when I got accepted into the VIPD Academy." Then the defense attorney instructed her that she had to answer her questions. The attorney then began reading from a deposition where Jones said allegedly that she had told Payne at the time that she had just been accepted into this agility test. Sorry for that. I know that might have been a little confusing, but what I'm trying to say is there was a discrepancy about maybe why exactly she was telling Payne and what Payne was then trying to give her in terms of this training. Then they started talking about the push-ups a little bit, and more questions where contentious again here. The defense attorney asked, did the court reporter get it wrong in this deposition? Chesney said maybe they did. The deposition got brought up several times, and inconsistencies, the defense says, between Chesney's deposition and then what she was saying on the stand. And the defense attorney even asked, did you read the deposition? Like, have you read your deposition in preparation of court? Like, do you even have a copy of this? And Chesney said, no, she didn't. Excuse me, going through my notes again. The defense then asked about other people being on the beach during this. And Chesney said, yes, there were other people on the beach. And the defense attorney then said, they were pretty close, right? And Chesney said, no, they weren't. The attorney then read again from this deposition where Chesney apparently said that there were people on the beach and they were about 10 yards away. And it got a little contentious here again. The defense attorney said, so pretty close, right? And Chesney said, 10 yards is far to me. It isn't far to you. It isn't 10 feet. I don't have a ruler. This kind of dialogue back and forth, or excuse me, not back and forth, but this kind of tension. So the defense also asked if Chesney had ever told anyone about the weapon. And Chesney said, yes. They reviewed the deposition material. Chesney had initially told attorneys about the weapon, but the question of whether she said exactly where in the vehicle the weapon was came up. The defense attorneys then asked why Chesney left VIPD, and they said, it's because you claimed there was sexual harassment happening at VIPD while she was an officer there. Jones responded and said there was sexual harassment happening at the Virgin Islands Police Department. Then there was an objection, and there was a sidebar called up to the attorney, or excuse me, up to the judge. When they came back, the defense asked Chesney, did you file a formal complaint against an officer? And Chesney said, yes, I did. Now, that was the end of, or excuse me, actually not the end. There's one more thing that's important to note. Jones, when talking about her Facebook post, said that people privately messaged her who said they knew Payne to be that type of way, the way of doing these things with women. When she said this, the prosecution immediately jumped up and stopped her and said she couldn't talk about that. They went up, there was a sidebar, they went and talked to the judge, and it was obvious that this was a big tension point. And as I said earlier, this is because of certain things that are and are not allowed to be introduced into testimony based on prior acts. And as I said, while Chesney's testimony was allowed, the case against Payne involving his former staffer and any other discussions, for example, maybe these women who messaged her, they were not allowed in court. And Chesney saying this actually got brought up when the jury was out of the room, and was discussion about potentially the defense calling for a mistrial. The defense ended up not calling for that, but that was a very big deal today in court. When prosecutors then redirected to Chesney, they asked why, or excuse me, hold on, let me catch up with my notes here. As I said, a lot of them today. Oh, yes, okay. So prosecutors asked Chesney a couple more questions involving why she never reported this at first. And Chesney said this was because she knew Payne's partner, that she knew her since she was a child. And this is Miss Powell. And the prosecution asked, how did your relationship with Miss Powell influence your decision whether or not to report this? And at this point, Chesney started crying again. And she told the courtroom that, like through tears, that she didn't want to hurt Miss Powell, that she respected her, and quote, "I genuinely love her." And so this was the reason why she didn't report until that Facebook post. Okay, that was the end of the prosecution's witnesses, and now we get to the defense's witnesses. I promise this isn't going to take too long. There were only two, and we can move through them relatively quickly. The defense's first witness that they called was Noelise Powell. This is Steven Payne's partner, girlfriend. This was the co-manager of the band, the person who Steffi moved in with after her living situation turned kind of south with Miss Madeline Marsh. So Miss Powell said that she intervened when Steffi was potentially going to be sent back to St. Lucia. This was important because Steffi's testimony and the prosecution's narrative was that Payne was the one who intervened and really led the charge of getting Steffi to stay in the islands and live with Miss Powell. But Miss Powell refuted that in her testimony. She said that it was her plan to it was her plan, a discussion to have Steffi move in, and that it was her plan to relocate Steffi to Florida. She said she had gotten close to Steffi as an educator because Miss Powell also worked at the Julius Sprouse School and still does work there. She said that because she'd gotten close to Steffi, both through school and in the band, she didn't want to see Steffi sent back to St. Lucia and have her education compromised and the opportunities in the band and everything like that. She said that while Steffi was living with her, she treated her as her own, that she really loved Steffi. But she also said that there was nothing odd between Steffi and Steven Payne. She said that Steffi never told her anything about an incident happening with Mr. Payne. The defense then asked her if she was a mandatory reporter of crimes like this. In other words, if someone comes forward with a crime, does she have to report this? She said, yes, as an educator, she does. So if she had heard about this, she would have to report it. She said she was trained in these kinds of situations as an educator. Powell then went on to say that she didn't recall Steffi or Steven Payne ever being alone together. She said they were always in a group. They were always in the band or moving as a unit. Now, when it comes to this daddy-daughter date that Steffi and the prosecution spoke about, where that first incident in the band room happened, Steffi says happened, Powell testified that she didn't recall Steffi ever going to St. Thomas alone with Steven Payne. She said she had never heard anything about this daddy-daughter date and that she hadn't even heard it referred to as a daddy-daughter date until court today. She then reiterated that it was her plan for Steffi to then move to Florida after the storms. And it was her idea to have Steffi move in with Shade Powell, her daughter. This is when she talked about getting those birth papers from a family member and kind of illegally moving Steffi to Florida. And then this issue of why Steffi had to leave her daughter's house came up. And once again, details weren't discussed. The defense said, you know that Steffi was no longer welcome in the house and that issues arose. And Powell actually started trying to explain, but there was immediately an objection and this was shut down. This was not allowed to be discussed in front of the jury. Powell then talked about how Steffi moved to Jacksonville to live with Lauren Harris, Steven Payne's sister. She said this was decided because after Steffi was no longer welcome in her daughter Shade's home, she couldn't bring Steffi back to St. John because of this immigration paperwork issue. Powell said if she went back to St. John, Steffi would have been deported and sent back to St. Lucia. So instead, Powell says she asked if Payne she asked Payne if Steffi could live out her senior year with his sister. She was living with Powell for her 11th grade year. And then it was her 12th grade year that she moved to Jacksonville to be with Auntie Lori, or Lauren Harris, Steven Payne's sister. She said she did this because she knew Payne cared, and that also Payne's son, Steven Payne Jr., was living with his sister at the time following the storms. Miss Powell was then excused, and the defense brought in their second witness. Their second witness was Lauren Harris, or Auntie Lori. This is Steven's sister. And she described what she does. She's a registered nurse. She has been one for 25 years, and she still lives in that same residence where the incident that this case centers on allegedly happened, at that residence in Jacksonville. Harris said she didn't know or have a personal relationship with Steffi before she lived with her, and that her brother had just called her and asked her to do a favor. She said she did this, but it was a lot. She was already housing her nephew, Steven Payne Jr. Now she was going to take on another teenager. She said, it was a full house. And she said that Steven Payne Jr. and Steffi were in the 12th grade together, that they both had their own rooms in the house, and that Steven Payne Jr. would drive Steffi to and from school in his car. She said that Steffi lived with her for 8 to 9 months during the senior year period, and that during that time, her brother, Payne, would sporadically visit. She said he would be there, maybe once, twice a month for a day or two. And she said he was there to check on the kids. But she did say that it was mainly about his son. She said Steven is very, very, very close with his son. She called them, quote, thick as thieves, and that Payne would come really just to be there with his son, that he had told her the hardest thing he had ever done was letting his son go to Florida and live away from him with his sister. Lauren Harris also said that Steffi and Steven Payne were never alone in the house the day the incident allegedly occurred. This is a very big disparity in the testimonies. So, as I said, Steffi says that this sexual battery involving the vibrator happened the day after she got to Lauren Harris's house. She says that everyone was out of the house. She wasn't yet enrolled in school. Lauren Harris says that this isn't true, that the day after Steffi arrived was actually the day that Steffi was enrolled in school. She said it was a Monday, and that they spent the entire day trying to get Steffi enrolled in the school. This was an issue because Steffi was coming from a different part of Florida, so she was viewed as a transfer student, and it was kind of difficult. They didn't have all the paperwork, if you will, and it had been easier to get her son or her nephew enrolled because when he came in the 11th grade, he was coming from the storms and was viewed as, it was kind of asylum, or someone, a refugee of sorts, if you will. So she described living with Steffi and said that she paid for Steffi's mother to come visit one day. She said that this happened after Steffi started crying to her about missing her mom one day. And I'm going to say that Lauren Harris's testimony at a couple points, it was like she was making fun of Steffi, for example, and kind of mocking. So when she was discussing Steffi crying about her mother, she kind of mocked Steffi crying. She used a high-pitched voice and she was saying, "Oh, my mommy, we're so poor," that kind of thing. The prosecution even objected to the way she was framing this. She said that because of this, she offered to pay for Steffi's ticket. She said that in hindsight, she viewed Steffi's crying in tears about this as a manipulation tactic, and that right when she offered to pay for the ticket, Steffi apparently stopped crying. That's what she said. She also testified that while in her care, Steffi began complaining of headaches and things like that, and that she took her to the doctor. Again, At this point, Lauren Harris starts using that kind of high-pitched mocking voice, saying that Steffi was saying things all the time like, my back hurt, my leg hurt, that kind of thing. Again, the prosecution objected. What she did say was that she did take Steffi to the doctor for some headaches and that the doctor prescribed her Zoloft, an antidepressant. The prosecution on cross-examination asked if Lauren Harris was ever concerned about this Zoloft prescription, if it ever came up. And Harris said she only really asked if Steffi was taking it or not taking it, and that she didn't dive further into it, and didn't question her anymore about this antidepressant that was being taken by a minor. Okay, so she said that Steffi then graduated from high school and she left and went back to St. Lucia just a couple days after. Ms. Harris said, quote, Steffi didn't say goodbye. She didn't even say thank you. She just left. She says that Steffi actually, the day after the graduation, went and stayed with her girlfriend. It wasn't detailed whether or not this was a girlfriend as in a friend or a girlfriend as in a romantic partner, but that she stayed with her girlfriend after the graduation and then left the next day, and that she didn't see Steffi after that. The defense then asked her a lot about her communication with Steffi after she left and went back to St. Lucia. And this is where Powell really detailed Steffi contacting her via WhatsApp, saying that Steffi was always complaining, asking for money, all of these kind of things, saying, and that she did in fact give Steffi money. She said she did send Steffi $250 via PayPal. And she also says that she sent a barrel of items that belonged to Steffi that had been in the house to St. Lucia for Steffi to retrieve. Harris said that when asked how she felt after hearing about these allegations, Harris said that she was shocked and she was devastated. When the prosecution cross-examined Harris, the attorney looked at her and said, so based on your testimony, it doesn't seem, or she actually said, based on your testimony and body language, it doesn't seem like you like Steffi. Is that correct? And Harris said, no, that's not correct, that she did like Steffi. The prosecution then asked, do you love Steffi? Harris said, I did love her, but I'm very disappointed in her. I know that she's not telling the truth, and I don't believe her. The prosecution then asked, if she was close with her brother and, her reasons for testifying today. And Harris said, quote, we're family. We look out for each other. We take care of each other. The prosecution then asked her, so you would do anything for your brother. Is that correct? And she said, quote, I would do almost anything for him. And this was when the defense rested their case. And this was the end of the witnesses that we heard today. I know we have been here together for a long time. There's been a lot of details, but this was the end of the testimony that we heard today. The jurors were excused. They were told they would have to be back tomorrow for the rest of the trial. However, there are no more witnesses per se, but there is one more person who may testify, and that is Steven Payne Sr. This would be the last person to speak in this case to give evidence. And we don't know if he's going to do that yet. The judge explained to Payne after the end of trial, which by the way went until 6:30 today, started at 9. She explained to him that he had a right to testify or not testify. His attorney said that they were going to discuss this after the hearing tonight, and that the judge would find out whether or not Payne was going to testify in his defense first thing in the morning. So no one is sure at this point. I even asked the defense attorneys after court today, which way they were leaning. They said they couldn't talk about that. And I also spoke with the attorneys a little bit more after court, just for the things that I may have missed when I wasn't allowed in the courtroom during that brief period. They gave me all of the information that I had already relayed to you. And that is where we are left as of today. The case is expected to wrap up tomorrow, or at least go into deliberation. Once again, we can't know how long the jury is going to deliberate for, but at the opening of the trial, it was discussed that they thought that, you know, everything would be wrapped up by tomorrow. So that is the end of today's recap, the end of Trial Watch for today. I know it was a long one. I will be back tomorrow, hopefully not as long of a day, but thank you so much for tuning in tonight and for hearing all of this. I will speak with you and see you all again tomorrow. Have a good evening.